With 2021 just around the corner, let's take a look back at what was a year to forget for NYCFC that somehow, even after the final kick, this continues to get worse. So just to briefly reiterate before we get into the meat and potatoes of the video, so to speak, let's just take a look back at the off-season decisions that were made by NYCFC, who they brought in, and let's get into it. So obviously the big thing they did was after Dome Toronto decided to leave NYCFC, they waited a while to announce the new head coach, Ronnie Dyla, but he came, and NYCFC had a relatively quiet offseason, which is something that we're going to get into. Why that may not have been good, why maybe it was. Um, but at face value, NYCFC finished first place in the East. One of the things they finished first place in the East, I should say, in 2019. Um, Most likely should have had a very good MLS Cup playoff run, but this isn't about 2019. It's about 2020. But I would like to give them the benefit of the doubt that they assumed that they had a pretty good 2019 squad, and one of the things that MLS teams don't really seem to do very often is retain players because obviously the MLS is a development league, so to speak. So the, they were able to re-sign a lot of the core group of starters that they brought in from 2019. Um, Noticeably, Ben Sweat was picked up by Inter Miami, so he was one of the names that left, but it was a familiar squad for this NYCFC squad. So, in terms of players brought in, there wasn't a lot going on. The big one, in terms of I guess talent possibilities, is Nicholas Acevedo. They brought in Udi Taranson and Gideon Zalim, who I don't think actually played a game due to injury. So we're going to talk about Ani Dyla a little later on. But that is a recap of the offseason decisions that were made by NYCFC headed into the 2020 calendar season. So before we really talk about it, I know I just said before we get into meat and potatoes, but before we get really into it, just a brief devil's advocate for a second here. Now, I think everyone understands that 2020 has been an absolutely insane year for a multitude of reasons. Um, and, you know, obviously, to play devil's advocate for Ronnie Dyla, you can play devil's advocate for the NYCFC front office. There were unfortunate circumstances in the club itself that they could not, predict or they could not fix. And one of those things, it's obviously a pandemic going on. You're not going to be able to bring in players. And the reason why that was very evident is because on two big occasions, NYCFC lost two very big players. One being their designated player, Alexander Matrita, who, because of family reasons, wanted to be closer to home. Due to travel restrictions in New York, wasn't able to visit his family. And, NYCFC did the right thing. You want to be a player for his club, you let your player leave without any issue. Technically speaking, he's on loan, so there is a small possibility that Matrita may come back to New York, although it seems unlikely at this current moment. And finally, you have the season-ending injury to Abear, which is really disappointing, really heartbreaking to see. Abear was a breakout player, not only for NYCFC, but in the MLS last year as a whole. And to see the injury he picked up definitely was not pretty. It was not good, of course, just put it lightly. And, to play devil's advocate for the NYCFC front office, you can't replace either of them. this season because it's a pandemic year. And to bring the players, they would have to quarantine for a number of weeks. It just really wouldn't pay. And I think that was one of the reasons why they were not replaced. So NYCFC essentially finished the season without a striker and without a designated player. And obviously, in the MLS, designated players are everything. They're a big part. The teams that win know how to spend designated player money. We saw it this season with the Columbus Crew. Lucas Valerian absolutely balled out in the MLS playoffs, balled out especially in the MLS Cup final, scoring 2 goals. And fortunately, NYCFC's designated players, we'll get into it more later on, but just weren't able to do that. So that is just briefly talk about the devil's advocate of why this season was a bit unfair to head coach Ronnie Dyla and to maybe even the NYCFC front office. So after the first 2 games of the MLS regular season, NYCFC lose, then both 1-0. There obviously is a break based on the COVID pandemic, and we're now fast forward into the MLS's back tournament. I think we could all agree was a very disappointing series of games for NYCFC. We got the group. We thought that it was going to be better. We thought that NYCFC, especially considering how their 2019 finished, we thought that it was going to be, a really good opportunity to get our first trophy, to get our first silverware. Albeit it was, some will argue that it was a glorified preseason tournament, which it definitely might have been considered. Of course, the stakes were a bit decent. A CONCACAF Champions League place was on the line, and I believe a prize pool of $1 million, which obviously for an MLS team is a decent amount of money. And I pictured this tournament as a really good moment for NYCFC to be a defining moment for them. I figured it was going to be an opportunity for them to get some, bad voodoo off their back, so to speak. The group stage portion, they get 3 points in 3 games, a one win. But the big moment, and at the time, I was calling this the biggest win in the history of the club, was their 3-1 win over Toronto FC. And, to beat Toronto in an elimination game, and not only to beat them, but to beat them rather comfortably, I would say. It just felt very good. It just, as a fan, it was very, very enjoyable to see that. Everyone played very, very well. And then, in typical NYCFC fashion, they just falter against Portland. And, uh, it goes back to what, we were talking about before. How serious do you want to take, um, how serious do you want to take the MLS's back tournament? Of course, NYCFC lost to Portland 3-1. And I believe Portland would eventually go on to win the whole tournament. So maybe that does bode a little well for NYCFC. But it was just a very conflicting MLS's back tournament. Of course, NYCFC were lucky, were fortunate to get into the tournament portion, the round of 16 portion against Toronto, having to rely on a bunch of other results that fell into NYCFC's hands. I believe it came down to the last game of the tournament with Christian Pavone scoring the game winner on a penalty kick in the 80th minute. But that wraps up the MLS's back tournament. Another opportunity in the trophy squandered. We thought it was going to be a big moment with the win against Toronto. It seemed like it was going to be a very big moment. But unfortunately, this wasn't NYCFC's day once again against a very good Portland team. So following the disappointment of the MLS is Back tournament, NYCFC actually finished the MLS regular season, the resumption of it, in actually pretty decent fashion. So their record finished with 12-3 and 8. 11 of those wins came after the MLS is Back tournament. So not including the MLS is Back tournament, NYCFC finished 11-3-4, which in the MLS is very, very respectable. The MLS is a very difficult league to win road games on normal circumstances. So the MLS season finishes. There were some bright spots, there were some low spots. NYCFC's thrashing of the Red Bulls was definitely the highlight of the regular season, with Castellanos scoring a hat trick. It's fun stuff all around. I don't think there's many complaints about the MLS regular season. To be fair, there were worrying signs that I think people were aware of. The consistency has always been an issue for NYCFC, and it showed in the regular season, of course. But one of the things that fans started to pick up on was Ronnie Dyla not really using his substitutes. And, under normal circumstances, that is still a little strange. But especially in a pandemic, where you have players who are playing, in a pandemic season, I should add, where you have players playing multiple games a week sometimes. And there's a lot of games going on in a relatively short period of time. And you have guys that are brought in. Nicholas Acevedo, who I talked about from Liverpool FC, obviously not the Liverpool, but brought in for an estimated fee, according to the transfer market, at $2.53 million. And statistically speaking, he played in 12 games, and all he did was get one yellow card and was on the pitch for 7% of the NYCFC season. He played 124 minutes. And in the MLS playoffs, he played 30. And obviously, that was because he was used, and the game went into extra time. We'll forget about that later. So, again, NYCFC not really able to bring anybody. But that had been the reason why Ronnie Dada didn't necessarily use a lot of substitutes. It was said, statistically speaking, that this is according to Elliot McKinley of American Soccer Analysis, Ronnie Dyla waited the longest in the MLS to make substitutions. On average, he didn't make his first substitute until the 79th minute, which I think for any team, for any circumstance, is a little bizarre. You have a relatively good bench with some good names on it. I don't know why you wait that long to bring on some players, especially, if in a tight game, whatever the case may be. But the MLS regular season finishes. There are some question marks. I think the majority of people thought the NYCFC finished on a rather high note. Not perfect, especially considering how the 2019 season went. But again, you lose a designated player without being able to replace him. You lose your only striker. You can't replace him. Fifth place in the East. You start building momentum. Now you're just hoping for the best against Orlando in the playoffs. All right, then let's talk about this again. So NYCFC makes the playoffs, and as the fifth seed in the Eastern Conference, they travel to Orlando to partake in the MLS playoffs. And we all know how the story goes. NYCFC lose on penalties is just to say it in a very boring way. Of course, the game itself was MLS on a pedestal. It is everything that makes MLS MLS. The absolute crazy story. Unfortunately, NYCFC was on the losing end of a crazy story that was seen and told around the soccer/football world. So NYCFC, bottom line, somehow, when it seems impossible, find more ways to lose big games. We NYCFC have been a part of many games in elimination games where they just look flat and they completely blow it, so to speak. Thinking about NYCFC's first ever MLS Cup appearance way back in 2016 to lose 2-0 in Toronto, and then obviously the big loss 5-0 at home at Yankee Stadium in their first ever home playoff game. And then obviously through the years, just more disappointment, more ways to lose. But nothing I think could have prepared us for what happened against Orlando. Just absolute craziness. And there's no reason to get into it much more. I think what it comes down to is why is, it's difficult to say because you don't want to put blame on one person, and it definitely wasn't the fault of one person or two people. You have 120 minutes to score that winner, 120 minutes to not have it go to penalties. So it is definitely not at the fault of Goody, but my question still haunts me is why did he shoot the ball top right? Now the penalty kicks prior, that smart thing was done and it was shot low and away because it's unnatural for. Again, the goalie was not a goalie; he was a defender. It was in a very obviously you're the favorite. He's in a very unorthodox position, so I feel like it's just a given that you shoot it low and away from the goalie. You try to find one of the sides, one of the corners on the ground. But nevertheless, the penalty kick was saved. It was a bit chaotic, and it's just very disappointing because something that's not talked about. Because obviously at the end of the day, NYCFC lost, and it's the big story. But if NYCFC find a way to win against Orlando in penalty kicks, Sean Johnson's save against Nani, easily a statue outside the new stadium in 2078. Of course, that's maybe a bit over the top, the statue I'm talking about, but the save against Nani was top class. I mean, that's one of the most notable players in the world, easily one of the most recognizable players in MLS. Who saved his penalty, especially because he scored, not he's converted his penalty for the first goal of the game in normal time, and that goes in, or excuse me, NYCFC win that game. That is easily NYCFC's biggest moment of their short lives. Easily the biggest moment in club history. To not only win a big game on the road in a tough environment, but that save, everything that happened, unfortunately, that moment now belongs to Orlando. So once again, NYCFC finds yet another way to lose a big game. So for who impressed and for who needs to improve, it's a little difficult to talk about because we obviously don't necessarily know what the team's going to look like next season. So, for example, one of the players that I think would have needed to improve would have been Ronald Monterita, but we'll talk about him more in depth later. But he's no longer on NYCFC. So I think what this is mainly going to be is who impressed and who/what needs to improve. And I feel like the who impressed is simple. It's team MVP, the best fullback in the MLS, easily on Tonton without question. What a player he is. And for what needs to improve, I feel like it's a very broad thing to say, but NYCFC's designated players sign-ins have to improve. NYCFC and Ronnie Dyla specifically has to do a better job substituting players, getting better rotations in. NYCFC up until this year, it seems like one of the things they were built around, molded around even, was retaining the key guys to their team, which most MLS teams really aren't able to do because, of course, MLS is a stepping stone league. The goal, the dream is not to play in the MLS for now and most likely for the foreseeable future. But what NYCFC has been able to do really well is they've been able to retain the overwhelming majority of their 2019 teams that finished first in the East, and it's been inconsistent for them year by year. Of course, they've lost notable players. Jack Harrison, David Villa decided to leave New York, um, but they've done a very good job of replacing them. And I think that's, again, I feel like depth wise, NYCFC have really impressed. The scouting department for NYCFC done a tremendous job finding players. I mean, a lot of their guys, a lot of the key guys that are household names, like Anton Zinnerholm, like Alexander Rain was, you know, like Collins, so on and so forth, are obviously not designated players. They are just really good signings. I mean, when Jack Harrison left New York, it was doom and gloom for a lot of people. Everyone said, how are we going to replace him? How are we going to replace his goal scoring ability? Well, I don't necessarily know if Ismail Tajiri Sharadi is better than Jack Harrison, but I certainly think he's definitely good enough to fill that role, especially coming off of the bench. But I think what needs to improve is NYCFC's designated players. So I'm not talking about Maxi Morales. Maxi Morales, one of the best players in MLS on his day. Of course, 2019 season, 20 assists. There's unreal production from him. And Matrita, put an asterisk over him. He's no longer with NYCFC. But when he was here, in and out. He was either very, very good, or he didn't even know he was on the pitch. Jesus Medina, I think, is definitely the player that needs to improve the most. Now, with that being said, he had a very good season this year. Ronnie Dylet seemed to know what to do with him, and he's certainly developed, I think, much better this season. I, but I think there still needs to be more if he's truly going to be a designated player. There's rumors going around that he's going to get no longer be a designated player following this season. But then I also think what needs to improve is, you know, just to briefly go over it. We talked about it before. Ronnie Dyla, substitutions. You have all this club depth. You're probably one of the most well-rounded teams in MLS. Use the substitutions more. Use that bench. But in terms of designated players, NYCFC needs a guy like a Pozuelo. They need a guy that is well known, relatively speaking, has played in big games in a relatively, top league in the world. I mean, Belgium is not the Premier League. The Belgian Pro League is not the Premier League. I don't think anyone would argue it is. It's not, it's not Serie A. It's not League One. You get the point. But they play big games in the Champions League. They play European competition. He's a player, to be honest with you, when he plays in the MLS playoffs, he's probably thinking to himself, I've played in Champions League games against Real Madrid. I've played in Europa League games, in group stage games where I need these 3 points. They have the experience. They have the veteran presence to be able to say, whatever. And NYCFC, I think, needs that guy. Matrita was a nice signing. He was good. We talked about it. Maxi Morales is Maxi Morales. Jesus Medina obviously needs to improve. But NYCFC need that guy. Before it was David Villa, but unfortunately David Villa didn't necessarily have the team around him. Now they don't have David Villa. They don't have that guy. There are names out there that I feel like would be the perfect role for that coveted designated player slot. Now I'm obviously not talking about Messi. That's a fever dream that may or may not be coming true in years to come. I'm talking about now, and and the players are. I'm probably gonna butcher the name, but Fisher I believe he plays for FC Copenhagen. He's not. He's around 28, 29 years old. He still has decent years left. He's been around playing big games for one of Denmark's best teams. Again, those are, I think, the realistic targets that you can acquire because it's another step in what has otherwise been a decent career for a player like that, and you give them a new challenge, you bring them to a new continent, a new experience, and we've seen it all, everywhere. Pozuelos is a household name in Toronto. Zalarian from Columbus. Obviously, he came from Liga MX, so it's different. But he comes to Columbus, and now he's a cult hero. And obviously, he's won an MLS Cup final. NYCFC needs that kind of player that is that is going to show up. You know, we're gonna get into the what looks like a rebuild later, very soon. But Alexander never showed up. Well, he never showed up this season in the playoffs. I mean, Maxi Morales did not show up in the playoffs. I mean, again, it's one game. I'm not saying it's anyone's specific fault, but we need a player that's gonna show up. We NYCFC need to find a designated player. It's gonna put New York City FC on the map once again, like David Villa did. So, in case you haven't heard by now, NYCFC has traded Alexander Rin to the new expansion side Austin and Ronald Monterita to FC Cincinnati, thus meaning NYCFC is most likely going through a rebuilding process. So, first things first, Alexander Rin and Ronald Monterita are fan favorites. They've been with NYCFC for a very long time. As a longtime NYCFC fan, a founding member, this is quite frankly heartbreaking when I saw the news that Alexander Rin was traded. He's a very nice guy. It seemed like he really loved being an NYCFC player, as did Monterita. It's just very disappointing to see these two go. The question of should the rebuild be started, I think, is an interesting one because necessarily, you see, I believe that this is MLS, and frankly, I don't believe in rebuilds in MLS. I think if you want to compete, you're going to spend the money to compete. I mean, you see it almost every year. A team that does poorly the year prior, you know, in a year or maybe even 2 years, is way up in the standings competing. So I think the term rebuild is a bit harsh with what it could potentially be. But I, I don't think, I think this NYCFC team, as of right now, in this current roster, would still be good enough to make the playoffs. But obviously, you need to bring in players, and I think that is the definition of if we're going to rebuild. If we don't do anything, anything of note, if we don't especially replace that designated player slot, then it is obviously a rebuild. We are obviously just waiting for something to happen. But the difference between MLS and every other major American sport, for the most part, is there really is nothing to rebuild. You know, without any no disrespect to the NCAA college system, very rarely do you ever get a gym as the number one, number two, number three, so far, so on and so forth pick. Now, Jack Harrison was one, of course. He turned out really well. But those are rare commodities. You very rarely get players in the MLS draft that turn out to be that good. That turn out to be, you know, quite frankly, MLS superstars. So I don't necessarily think it's worth anything to have a rebuild unless you're just trying to save money, for a year on players and you just want to have a year where you can learn the system or whatever the case may be. I honestly don't know. Because again, even without Alexander Rin and Ronald Monterita, you're still a team that finished first place in the East in 2019. You still finished in fifth place in the East this season. You still have a relatively good team without even replacing anybody yet. So I don't necessarily think the rebuild should be started, if it even is. And again, as I've said briefly, losing Alexander Rin and Ronald Monterita hurts. Monterita and Alexander Rin, were focal points in the starting lineup. almost every single game, especially Alexander Rain. I mean, the only time Alexander Rain ever missed a game is if he was suspended, because that's the kind of player he is. I mean, it's, it's very disappointing that he's gone. But again, I think it's one of those things we have to wait and see. As we'll get into, it's all about what they do with that money. What they do with the $1.2 million they got for Alexander Rin and the roughly $600,000 they got for Ronald Monterita. So, in conclusion, was this season a failure? I think it is. But I think there's also a very large asterisk on that. That we didn't win any silverware. We had a really bad player performance once again. But it was such a crazy year. You weren't able to bring in any reinforcements for the injured players. You weren't able to bring in another designated player to replace, Alexander Matrita. You lose your only striker with a very serious injury for the whole year. You know, it is as anyone as a fan, I expected more. I expected to at least get, at least maybe make it to the Eastern Conference semifinals, to at least advance, a round or two. Because again, the MLS regular season actually, the NYCFC did well. They were inconsistent, but they showed up, especially towards the tail end of the season. So you thought that hopefully they were going to carry that momentum, but clearly they didn't. So I think when it comes down to about the 2021 season is what the road ahead is, what the next months hold. Are they going to bring in a designated player, or maybe even two, depending on if Jesus Medina gets bought down to a TAM player or whatever MLS wants to call it? Are they gonna, you know, are they gonna trade away more players? This NYCFC team definitely has some young pieces, but there's definitely pieces that aren't exactly spring chickens anymore. And look, one of the things that NYCFC don't really do is get MLS talent. And what I mean by that is, they are a team that when players arrive at NYCFC, it seems like 90% of those players don't have any experience in the MLS. They really do not go for MLS players. I mean, if I were to just briefly remember the general lineup, I don't think any of those players had MLS experience other than Sean Johnson. The typical starting 11 for NYCFC prior to when they got here, I don't believe any of them had MLS experience. Of course, not including the youth academy players of James Sands. I mean, that's kind of obvious. But, maybe that's the next step, to get MLS players in, the ones that have experience. Because in MLS terms, you have a lot of GAM, TAM, RAM, whatever you want to call it now. I'm sure, they have more than just that to give. They're a big market team. Why not go after an MLS talent of some of these, kind of iffy teams that are kind of maybe in the same process of not necessarily figuring out where they are? Because I think that's also one of the things that I would like to see. I would like to see NYCFC make more moves in MLS. Bring some MLS talent, proven MLS talent. Obviously not grizzled veterans, but guys that are in their prime, 26, 27, 28. Realistic targets. I'm gonna be honest, I don't know. But I'm sure there's some out there. And obviously NYCFC doesn't necessarily have a problem moving their players to MLS teams. We've seen that a lot before. Obviously, some of those moves not necessarily in their control. Obviously, Ben Sweat got drafted, but as you've seen very evidently now, Alexander Rain traded to Austin, Monterita traded to Cincinnati. So they don't shy away from that. I think it's just time, to bring in a really talented designated player. Because David Villa, Andre Pirlo, and Frank Lampard were nice. It was And to say David Villa was nice was an understatement. Is an understatement. But this is a new era of MLS. I mean, unless you can get, I mean, again, there's certain circumstances that you make for a player like Messi. But unless you can get a player of 90 about like 90 plus in terms of European stature, that kind of thing, with the veteran presence kind of thing, the age of them, then you have to go for a young designated player or a designated player that I mentioned that's in their prime or just out of it, like the 28, 29 range, where they can still give you 2 to 3 years of really good play. You know, for the final thoughts, the conclusive thoughts, I think NYCFC can still compete next season. Are they going to be the favorite? Absolutely not. At least in terms of what the roster looks right now. But whether it be they add more players or lose more players, I can almost guarantee that the roster is going to change from this point on New Year's Eve, 152 on Thursday. So hopefully NYCFC can bring in some players. Hopefully those players can be what NYCFC need for, if not this season, the year after. And the big thing, you're looking at it right now, we cannot play in a baseball stadium anymore. But I understand the logistics and the legality, whatever. It's very difficult to build a stadium in the New York metropolitan area, in New York City. But we cannot play in a baseball stadium. I mean, can you imagine Lionel Messi playing in a baseball stadium? Not good. Not good. Funny, but not good. Thank you for tuning in, and let's go NYCFC.